Welcome to the Gamers Tavern, episode 16. Ross is about to say it's episode 15, but again, last week I mentioned this, there were some audio issues, so we had to swap around the order. We've gotten everything sorted, which is a good thing because there is a lot of good content here. We have two amazing guests, Colin McComb and returning guest Darrell Hardy. And Darrell especially deserves some congratulations because we actually recorded this a month ago to the day. And since we recorded this, and today, there is a new addition to the Hardy household. Another little gamer has joined the Hardy clan. So we would like to wish Darrell and his family congratulations on their new addition. And I also have to issue an apology to you, our listeners. There were, again, audio issues with this episode. The biggest one is one I didn't find out about until I was editing it, because about an hour in, Colin McComb's audio feed, I believe the technical term in audio engineer circles is goes batshit crazy. You can still hear what he's saying for the most part, but it does sound horrible, and I did my best to clean it up, and there's only so much you can do, and I do apologize for the quality, but yeah, there's only so much you can do to make up for it. Go ahead and head over to the bar. First round's on me. Grab a drink, and then take a seat at the table in the corner, and we'll be right back after this word from our sponsor. Hello gamers, I'm Darrell Mott Jr. from Anacle News Tabletop and the Gamers Tavern podcast, which you probably know because I'm betting I was just talking a second ago. I'm sure you already know about DriveThruRPG, as it is the biggest repository for digital copies of your favorite games. Dungeons & Dragons, Shadowrun, Battletech, World of Darkness, Numenera, Fate, and so many more. And sometimes there are pennies on the dollar because, face it, PDFs can sometimes be so much more convenient than print copies, but if you need print copies, they sell those too. So if you want to support the Gamers Tavern podcast, click on the affiliate links in the show notes and check out DriveThruRPG.
Hello and welcome to episode 15 of the Gamers Tavern. I'm your host, Ross Watson.
And I'm Darrell Mott Jr.
And tonight we have with us two very special guests, Mr. Darrell Hardy and Mr. Colin McComb.
Hello, this is Colin.
And this is Darrell.
Thanks so much for coming on the show with us tonight, guys, because we have a really big topic. We're going to talk about world building, and it was really hard for me to think of anyone more qualified to talk about world building than the two of you.
Thank you.
Sorry, I just had an interruption. What was that again now?
Say it again, Ross.
I know.
I was saying thank you for coming on the show to be with us tonight, because there's no one I can think of more qualified to talk about world building than the two of yourselves.
Oh man, I missed out on that. I am a terrible person. I apologize. I was getting it's not important. I thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here.
Well, one of the first things we're going to do is we're going to make sure the listeners know who you are. And here in the Gamers Tavern, the thing we'd like to do is to ask you for your gaming character sheet. Now, Darrell Hardy's actually been with us before, so I'm going to start off with him so he can give us, just sort of a quick recap, and then we'll dive into yours, Colin, because you have a pretty extensive character sheet, and I want to make sure the listeners hear the whole thing. So, Mr. Hardy, if you would, tell us briefly about your character sheet as a gamer.
All right. I'm a level 12 freelance writer and game designer. We're doing levels, right?
It can be level, it can be archetype, it can be whatever you want.
Okay. Multi-class.
It could even be diceless if you want to, go true heretic.
Let's not get dangerous here. All right. Writer and game designer in tabletop and video games. Most recently, released the My Little Pony CCG that I helped design. That's an actual physical tabletop product. Before that, I've done other tabletop RPGs for Dark Skull Studios, and online collectible card games for Sony Online Entertainment and others. That's me shortly.
Well, I think I just want to add really quick that you also have a very interesting blog about world building. It's called Story World Development. Is that right?
Yes. Well,
okay.
I mean, the blog is darrellhardy.com.
Right.
But the Story World creation is a recurring theme there.
Okay. Excellent. Thank you very much, sir. And Mr. Colin McComb, would you please tell our listeners what your gaming character sheet is like, what they know you from, and where they can find you on the web?
Well, sure. I guess since I'm doing Numenera stuff these days, I would be, I guess I'll call myself a charming Jack who casts nets of words.
Nice.
I have been...
Careful, it's starting to sound like a bard.
Well, yeah, except I have absolutely no musical talent. It's actually pretty sad. Anyway, so...
Me too, that's why I play punk music.
That's why I play keyboard. People are like, oh, you play piano? I'm like, no, I mean I type. And they're like, thank you. You guys are the first ones who've ever given me a laugh on that one. Everybody else is just like, you suck. So I've been gaming since about 1980, from the original Blue Box D&D, and I got into designing games straight out of college, actually, with my philosophy degree. I was the first one to actually get a job out of college, which was nice. Everybody who was saying, oh, you want fries with that? It's like, yeah, here's the fries, bitches. Like this, I got a job.
You heard it here first. Colin McComb is the very first person ever to get a job out of college.
Yes. This is why I have an editor.
With a philosophy degree, no less.
I know. So I started working at TSR in 1991. And I started off with Dragonlance stuff, and they quickly shoved me onto other things. I wound up co-creating the Birthright campaign setting with Rich Baker. And then I went on to do even more development work on the Planescape campaign setting, and it was that work that got me noticed by Interplay Productions, which had 3 computer games with the Planescape license in the at the time. So they hired me away to be the lead designer on one of those. 2 of those got canceled because they realized, holy shit, we're doing three computer games with this license. That's nuts. So they canceled 2 of them, and they rolled me onto Planescape Torment, where I worked with Chris Avalone for the remainder of my time at Interplay. After that, I went freelance for a while. And then got back into the computer gaming industry hardcore with work on Wasteland 2, which I did a couple of years ago. Only last year? Yeah, it was only last year.
Time flies.
Yeah. And shortly after that, Brian Fargo, the owner of An Exile, called me up and said, Colin, how would you like to be the creative lead for this new Torment game? And I said, I would love that so much I'd just wet my pants.
Now, Colin, the reason I wanted to make sure and get you on the show for this particular topic is, as any listeners of the show know, I'm one of the biggest Birthright fans since ever been, ever. But on top of that, you also designed, as you said, Planescape, which is just really, really unique and distinct as a world. But I think possibly your least known foray into world creation in the RPG world was Thunder Rift.
Yeah, I loved Thunder Rift.
And I do too, and I talked about it actually pretty recently in our discussion about basic Dungeons & Dragons. And I have a quick story I want to share about that, because the day I bought Thunder Rift at the store, I bought it at Walden Books. And I also shopped for novels at the same time, so I bought my adventure, or I bought, in this case, my campaign setting. And I bought a Battletech book on the same day, because I really liked Battletech at the time. And I went up to the counter, and can you guess, I don't know if you know, but there's a book called Decision at Thunder Rift. And it is a Battletech book. So the guy at the counter is like looking at these 2 things, and he's like, one of them has a wizard on it, and the other has giant robots on it. And he's like, are these related? And I'm like, no, but they could be. Like, the next thing out of my mouth was like, man, wouldn't it be cool if... Battletechs in Thunder Rift, but so there you go. I thought that would be a funny story in case you didn't know about it.
I was actually kind of hoping that you had melded them together. That would have been a really awesome story.
You know what? Honestly, I've never been able to run a game in Thunder Rift, but I've always wanted to. So it's on my to-do list of things eventually to do is to run a game set in Thunder Rift.
Thunder Rift did teach me one very important thing about world building, and I would like to just add that this was, I think, probably the third product I had ever officially designed for TSR. But they gave me the big map sheets. I'm like, holy shit! I'm working with David Sutherland and Diesel, and oh my god. This is just, my first day at TSR, Zeb Cook and Jeff Grubb walked into my office. They're like, let's go get some lunch, new guy. I was like, oh. Yeah.
Wow.
I was like, holy shit, I'm actually doing this. Oh, wait, are we allowed to swear on the show?
Yeah,
Fuck
you're allowed
yes.
to swear. It's,
Okay.
It's allowable.
Okay, good. I didn't want to have to get beeped out or anything. So anyway, I'm sitting there and I'm drawing this map and I'm all really proud of it. I mean, it was basically, the best map I've ever done in my professional life, probably. I burned out pretty early on that. So anyway, I've got this map done out and I pass it over to Diesel and Dave Sutherland, and they're looking at it and they're drawing it all up, and I'm like, yeah, it looks really good. And I think it was Diesel. He's like, yeah, there's just one problem. I was like, what's that? He's like, well, when rivers flow, they flow together. They don't split apart. And I was like, you gotta be kidding me. So if you look at the Thunder Rift map, you'll notice that the rivers don't actually make any goddamn sense.
Well, in a fantasy setting, geographical truth is one of the probably last things I worry about, honestly. But there you go.
That's probably true, but for some people it might be a total immersion breaker. Geologists pick it up and they throw it across the room. This thing's a piece of shit!
Well, the next thing we're going to do, before we jump into the full meat of our topic, is we're just going to briefly talk about what we've been playing lately. And again, I think, I'm going to start with Mr. Mott, and then into Mr. Hardy, and then end up with you as well. Because, again, it's likely that you're going to be playing a lot of stuff. So, Mr. Mott, what have you been playing lately?
I have recently been playing a Kickstarted game from Stonemaier Games, I want to say. It's called Euphoria. I haven't had a chance to run it with my friends yet. I've just been kind of playing around with it, trying to learn the rules on my own. What it is, it's a worker placement game where each player runs their own sort of 1984 Big Brother inspired dystopian world. And it's very Art Deco design, so it's got a lot of BioShock influence in it as well. And the goal of the game is to get as many victory points as you can by accomplishing as much as you can without letting your workers know too much. Because if they know too much and start to see behind the curtain, they'll abandon you. And so you'll lose your points because you don't have workers to get points. So you have to have a little balancing act in there. And it's a really cool mechanic, and I'm really dying to try it out.
Cool. What about you, Mr. Hardy? What have you been playing lately?
Well, I've been playing Hotline Miami on the computer.
I was going to say, is that like a board game like Dream Phone or something like that? Dream Date?
No, it is. I mean, you stick it in the lo-fi top-down shooter genre, but it's brutal. One shot will generally kill anybody, including you, and the movements of the enemies are somewhat randomized. You can't just memorize the level, and the whole thing is just drenched in 1980s neon with this throbbing Miami Vice techno soundtrack. It's really quite the package. And
sounds cool.
I recommend tracking down some YouTube videos. Tabletop, we're playing Star Wars Saga System. My gaming group, apparently, before I joined, had a fantastic time with Saga System a few years ago. And so when the new Star Wars came out, they started talking about it, and they're like, yeah, that sounds cool. But remember that stuff we used to do with Saga? That was so awesome. We should do that again. And so they put the Edge of the Empire back on the shelf and dug out their square books and they rolled up some Jedi, and turns out we're really incompetent. So
There's one thing I did really like about Saga that I don't think many games have gotten into since then, but it's the idea of the reputation system. Mm-hmm. And the fact that if you wanted to, you could actually start out with a bad reputation and use it. Because having a bad reputation didn't mean that you couldn't do things. It just meant you did different things differently than the good reputation guys.
Okay. Well, I haven't run into that yet, so I don't know if it's
Well, maybe that's pre-Saga. Maybe that was the D20, but okay.
That could be. That could be. I'm pretty new to it, so I'm sure there are nuances that I've simply overlooked.
And Mr. McComb, what have you been playing lately?
Let's see. Tabletop, I've been pretty much sticking with Numenera for role-playing games, obviously, because of the whole Torment thing. But when we get together with the other geek parents in Grosse Pointe, we play Settlers of Catan, we play, let's see, what is it, Seven Wonders, Pandemic, all the good Euro games. I keep on trying to, I keep threatening the kids that I'm going to bust out the Pathfinder Beginner box, but they wind up grabbing the iPads. And
Ooh.
Yeah,
Pathfinder Beginner box is a great product, though.
Yeah, it looks really nice. It's just that, I can't really shut them down when they say, Dad, we'd like to play computer games. I can't be like, that's wasting your mind! Oh.
You might try easing them into it with the Pathfinder Adventure card game.
Oh, that, if it were still available for sale, but it's sold out everywhere, isn't it?
It might be just for Christmas, and they're waiting for a new printing, because the Beginner's box is sold out right now, too. They're reprinting it in March.
Wow. Yeah, I could get the kids started with Cards Against Humanity, but I think they might be a little young.
That would be.
I finally got my last piece of the holiday bullshit in today. It's the I didn't get them in order, so I ended up getting the Funny Pages, which is like this newsprint comic strips they got all these webcomic artists to do, but it's like old school Sunday newspaper comics, and it's really awesome. But the capper was what should have come on the 12th day, which is the last one. I now have in my possession a Cards Against Humanity card, printed professionally, matches the set perfectly. It's a white card, and it says, Darrell Mott.
That's probably the worst thing that you could have in a Cards Against Humanity deck. I can see that.
Combine that with a Bukkake show, and you're just... Ooh,
whoa!
Yeah, hey, I didn't mean to imply anything. I apologize.
Wow.
Someone actually posted on
this escalated
Reddit.
Quickly. I think.
So Cards Against Humanity was involved, so of course.
Yeah, it's true. So anyway, computer games. I've been playing BioShock Infinite because Chris Avalone recommended it so highly, and I've been enjoying the hell out of that. Just been playing the DLC that came out. That was fun. We got my kids' Steam accounts for Christmas, so we're playing Portal 2 together. Joint testing initiatives. Yeah, it's great. And then I'm playing the hell out of the Wasteland 2 beta, which is also just a pile of fun. It's total old school gaming.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that when that finally gets full release. I'm definitely going to be a buyer.
Well, tell me what you think of the Coliseum when you get there.
Okay, I sure will. For myself, I've been playing some, in tabletop-wise, it's been really rough because of the holidays. At the time of this recording, it's actually only a couple days before Christmas. And as you know, getting people who have families and schedules, to line up for tabletop in this few weeks is really, really tough. So I've kind of got my head in Malifaux right now, which is actually a miniatures game. But it's related to tabletop RPG because it has to do with Through the Breach, which is the Malifaux RPG that I'm also working on. So there's that. Video game-wise, I'm doing something I said I wouldn't do because I'd been one of those people that didn't want to play Mass Effect 3 when it came out. I was so deeply disappointed with what I'd heard about it. So I decided to give it a try, and so I'm working my way through Mass Effect 3, and I'm finding it to be maybe not as bad as I'd thought, but I certainly am seeing some flaws that I think I would probably like to discuss maybe in my blog at a future point. But so that's what I've been up to. Yeah,
Mass Effect 3 is, BioWare is really good at what they do. I've gotten in trouble.
Well, they had been
before, yeah. Well, they're professionals. They know what they're doing when they put this stuff out. So, I think that was just a case where they maybe bit off a little more than they could chew.
I think we could probably have a whole show dedicated to Mass Effect 3. And certainly even just like game endings, because I am still going to give, although I think Chris is a brilliant writer and brilliant game designer, I'm still going to give him crap for the end of Neverwinter Nights too.
Let it go, man. Let it go.
You know what? In case you're not aware, and spoilers, but in case you're not aware, the ending of Neverwinter Nights 2 is literally rocks fall and everyone dies. And it's kind of like a what? So you can blame that one on Chris. But anyway, let's get into actually our topic. Let's talk about world building. It's probably the good thing to start with. Like, let's talk about the question, answering the question. And I'm going to pitch this to, let's say, Mr. Hardy first. Mr. Hardy, what do you think is world building? If someone asked you, like, what is it?
Well, I think I would have to ask them, what do you mean?
What do you mean?
What do you mean by that? And the reason I say it,
I wish for more wishes.
Right. And that's why I call it the most pretentious business card in the world. Because I say writer, game designer, and story world architect. Like, really? Well then. Because world building can be lots of things. I mean, in video games, there are people who are professional world builders, and they're like experts in Maya and ZBrush and in crafting 3D things. Then there and some of them are also very good at setting up. Okay, we need point of interest here. We need a kind of laying out the like very large level design.
Well, I think I'm sorry, but. And I mean no disrespect to people who are level designers, because that is a challenging craft. But I would argue that level design is a separate skill from world building.
Yes, I agree. I think that's much more specific. But
it seems to me like it'd be something a little bit more closer to adventure design in terms of trying to compare video games to tabletop.
Sure. But I think the heart of world building, like we're talking about, is creating a setting for other people to play in. I mean, obviously, there's world building you can do just for yourself if you're like an author, and this is your world. Where you create the setting, the characters, the conflict, making sure that you have enough to work with. And I guess it doesn't have to be large enough for other people to play in. That's me with my story world conceit. But I
think it's fair for the purposes of our discussion. We are all talking about role-playing games and world building and role-playing games. So, I mean, if you want to establish one of the baselines, and if I understand what you're saying correctly, is you're saying part of world building is it has to be where other people can play in it. Right.
Yes.
I think that's a very reasonable and excellent point.
Right. I think you give them enough tools that they can work with it, enough guideposts they can find their own way around in it. Large enough that they can play with it, but not so limitless that they might as well just do it themselves.
Okay, good answer.
Eventually.
Mr. McComb, what would you say if someone asked you, what is world building?
I would say pretty much the same thing Darrell said, actually. I would say, actually, if you want me to be really concise about it, I would call it just creating a shared imaginative space. Self-contained, I guess. A shared self-contained imaginative space in which people can then build stories together. With or without the intercession of a GM, it depends, I guess, on whether or not you're building a product line around it as well. But ordinarily, I would say it's just a place where people can get together and tell the stories.
Yeah.
Okay. That's an excellent answer, too. Mr. Mott, what would your answer be?
Probably the same as Colin and Darrell's.
All right, well, the show's over.
Okay.
Yeah, that was good.
To try to rephrase a little bit to be a little bit more of what I would say, world building is basically creating the playground for people to go run into. It's a lot of fun. I've done a lot in my games where I've created my own campaign settings for my games instead of running something pre-built. But I've never done it on any sort of professional level, so I'm probably going to be asking a lot of questions because I'm really wanting to learn more about how to do it properly. But it's about creating... You're starting off with a completely blank canvas, and you're wanting to basically balance out how much of that canvas you fill out so that you have room to expand later on, but you still have established things in it. You still have a setting, you still have characters, you still have cities, and whatever you have in that particular genre, you've got enough to start from. That's what you're trying to do, is build an entire world and give players room to grow, but still have a shared understanding of what the world is.
What's interesting is I think it was great that you all gave an answer, but you also kind of all said, well, what the other guy said. It's the same kind of answer, because that is actually a great segue into the next question I was going to ask. Well, and I'll rephrase it in the form of my own experience as a designer who creates worlds and so forth. How do you guys feel about taking other people's ideas and repurposing them for your own setting?
In what context, I guess?
Well, okay, let's be clear. We're not talking about outright plagiarism. We're talking about adaptation.
I will talk about that for a moment, because it's one of the big splits in what I do in terms of world building and what you three do in terms of world building, is that I'm running a home game. I can steal whatever the hell I want. And I do constantly, because it is easy. It's a shortcut. It's something that the players would know. It gives them sorts of familiarity with the setting immediately. But there's also ways of borrowing stuff and kind of filing off the serial numbers. For example, originally Gary Gygax wasn't allowed to use the word hobbit. So he kind of filed off the serial numbers and they became halflings. It still gave you the same feel of what you had in The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings when it comes to hobbits, but it wasn't technically a hobbit.
I like it. I think it's very inspirational in terms of taking. I can't think of any concrete examples offhand, but let's say you want to do something that doesn't really work. So let's say I want to take my inspiration from Harry Potter and apply it to my accursed campaign.
Well, you could certainly do that.
Just to kiss ass a little bit. And I mean, like, what, magical? That there really are no parallels. So you can't just file the serial numbers off and drop it in and go, hey, we're going to go to this magical school. You're like, okay, well, what would that be in this world overrun by forces of darkness and witches and stuff? I'm like, well, maybe it's this enclave that the Blood Witch has set up for her own amusement, and so basically once you start forcing the parallels, like, well, if that's the case, then what would Quidditch look like or something? Well, clearly it wouldn't be Quidditch. It would be, and so by the time you get done syncing up the things, what you end up with looks nothing like what you started with, which is good because you don't want it to be just recognizable. But I think it's a good, because again, just looking at a blank slate, going, must create something cool here. Whereas you can say, okay, let's take some inspiration from something that is cool, and then work from that rather than from a blank slate.
Well, I'm going to just quickly push back a little bit. I mean, I think you're coming from the right perspective. I really like what you said there, but at the same time, I'm going to push back a little bit when you say things like it shouldn't be recognizable. I think there's ways to do it as a homage, and to make it recognizable where it's still. It's still not like, as we said, it's not plagiarism, but it's clearly still something that people can recognize and go, oh, this adventure is just like Die Hard, isn't that cool? Even though it's not taking place in Nakatomi Plaza and we're not talking about Bruce Willis, right?
Sure.
Sure. There's ways to make it recognizable, I think, that still enhance the experience rather than take away from it.
Well, I don't know. I think, I'm going to argue on Darrell's side here. I think that it is even better to file it down just past that point so people can be like, oh, this is kind of like, but they're not going to be like, okay, well, now's the bit where I, go shove the terrorist down the elevator shaft with a bunch of C4 strapped to him.
Well, yeah, homage is different enough.
No, damn it, you meant.
How dare you, sir?
But I would like to get back to the whole point of Hogwarts in your world, which is that I think it would be a cool coven, or like almost like a witch's coven. All the the hunters essentially put their kids here to train from the best, and Quidditch then becomes a training exercise. It's a war game at that point for them.
It's more like Ender's Game almost.
Exactly.
Ooh. You see, now that would be a fun thing to even riff off a little bit there.
See, so Darren just threw you that one as a freebie.
Well,
sorry, Darrell threw you that one.
And that's where I'm coming from. Is I think if you take it and you're riffing off of it, to use a musical term, you're taking that idea and you're doing something cool and interesting with it without copying it exactly.
Exactly. If you're copying it exactly, then it just becomes, you might as well just, rip the pages out of the book and stick them in there. Hey, Ma, look what I wrote. But artists, I may be so arrogant as to call our assembled little gathering here a bunch of artists. Artists have always taken inspiration from other people. It's the whole conversation of industry moving forward. You take, you look around at what other people are doing, you say, oh man, that's really cool. I wonder if I could do something like that, but change it a little bit for my sensibilities. And I think that is absolutely a legitimate thing to do. You don't want to be the person who's like, oh yeah, and look, I've got this albino with a soul drinking sword, and you're like, get out of here, you suck. But you can do something like that.
I've got this totally original idea. He's a drow who has 2 scimitars, and he's different than all the other drow. Yes. Yeah.
Yes.
So sometimes
in this case, it's because he's evil.
Sometimes there's a very specific thing that maybe can be overdone. Even riffing off of it can sort of become tired.
Well, I think what both Colin and Darrell are talking about here isn't so much crap, my microphone just attacked me.
That's not what I was talking about.
So maybe this new microphone doesn't like me that much.
Someone call Michael Bay. The new Transformers film begins in Darrell Mott Jr.'s house.
My microphone just came up and popped me in the nose. Anyway, what they're talking about is less about actually, taking something and kind of doing an homage to something by putting it into their game. They're talking more about using that as inspiration, as sort of a jumping off point for the thought exercise. And the end product is going to be still have some of those same tropes to play on, but is going to be something that's completely different because they're basically hammering the crap out of it to get it into a new shape as they're trying to fit it into the genre and the story that they're trying to tell with this world.
Okay.
Does that sound about right?
Yeah, sure. That's reasonable.
Well, I think it depends. It depends on the product too. So, like, My Little Pony. I'm looking at the card game right where I'm sitting here. It's a much more self-aware, pop culture savvy property. So I think if they were to do a Die Hard episode, they'd go all out. It would be an homage. It would be. Now's the part where we strap a terrorist with the C4. Okay, that wouldn't happen.
The paintball episode of Community.
Yes, although I don't know if those were specific scenes from Community.
Ho ho ho!
Yeah,
now
okay,
I have
all right.
friendship.
No, they ripped off a lot of scenes directly from Die Hard and Rambo, especially.
We talked about Die Hard a lot in the gaming and film episode, so let's.
Well, it's that time of year.
It is. It totally is the Die Hard time of year. But let's try really hard to not die hard and and focus a little more on our
here's a question I'd like to throw to you guys on this topic. What about something like Ravenloft, where there was a lot in that system, some of the most iconic characters from it, like Strahd, like Adam, are pretty much carbon copies of traditional fiction. Strahd is a Urstat's Dracula. Adam is Urstat's Frankenstein's monster, for example. Mm-hmm. So it is really, really obvious what they're doing, even if they changed enough of the details that it's not actionable.
Sure.
To use a legal term there. But what about something like that when it comes to world building? Is that going, in your opinion, too far? Or not dissing Ravenloft at all for this, but using it as an example?
Well, if there was only someone here who had worked on, a setting that had Frankenstein's monsters and vampires and things in it. It's truly a shame.
Yeah.
Wait. No, totally. I've done that. Actually, Darrell and Colin are helping me do that. To be clear to the listeners, actually, Darrell did in fact work on the world building for Accursed, and Colin is in fact doing an adventure for it. So,
plus I worked on Ravenloft.
Plus he worked on Ravenloft, so he's the perfect guy to answer this question.
And the answer is, I think it depends on the property that you're talking about. For something like Ravenloft, there is almost an expectation that you're going to be hitting some of these beloved tropes, and it's okay to do it there because people kind of expect it. I mean, one of the adventures I wrote there was basically just Hound of the Baskervilles. But for other settings, let's take say Birthright. we can't just. We're obviously influenced by Tolkien and Lord of the Rings there, but we couldn't just be like, okay, and now here we've got these, we've got the elves and we've got the dwarves, and so we had to shove it, 2 or 3 degrees aside so that we could say, okay, this is actually, this is our own thing now. This is a thing that we can put our own stamp on and say that we made up this world.
But it has the flavor of its material that you used as your inspiration.
Exactly, it does have some of that flavor, and
that's where Ravenloft is using those tropes, is to have the flavor from those classic horror things.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, well, that's a really good point to talk about. Like, if we're going to, if someone is listening to this show and they're like, well, how do I create a world? They're going to say, Mr. Hardy, what is the first place? Where do I start to build a world?
Characters, well, 2 places, I guess. Characters and conflict. Because the 2 things are very closely intertwined. Because you don't want to have a world without conflict, because that's boring. And then the characters are often defined by the conflict. So if there's, rebellion against the evil empire, for example, are they rebels? Are they Imperials? Are they just merchants trying to make a living, somehow caught up in between? Are they, just it's very broad strokes, where the characters are defined by the conflict. And of course, I'm assuming, RPG world building here. Other products.
No, we're talking about RPGs right now.
Right. So, characters in conflict within the context of what kind of adventures do you want the characters to have?
Would you shorthand that to tone, maybe?
I wouldn't, but
okay.
I can see how you'd get there.
Okay. So it's related to tone, but it's not quite exactly tone.
Right.
Okay.
I think tone is not specific.
All right.
I don't think it's specific enough.
Mr. McComb, where do I start as a world builder?
Well, I'm going to go back to the, what is world building, and it's creating the shared imaginative space. So I think the first thing you have to do, this is the way I approach it, is I ask myself, 1 second, I have a small child walking in.
That's a very odd question to ask yourself. That might explain a lot about Planescape, though.
Okay. Where did this small child come from? Is the first question. Every time I start a new world, it's, where did this kid come from?
Create a new world, one family at a time.
So now
I knew Colin McComb was prolific, but I had no idea.
Yeah. You should see what winds up in the tissues.
Wow.
Whoa, sorry. Too much? Okay. Okay, so anyway, the first question I ask myself is based around, the shared imaginative space. And that is, what are the stories that we're going to want to tell together? What are the things that I'm going to want my players to walk away from with this world and say, this is the thing I remember. That's basically where I go from there. So once I have that figured out, then, just like Darrell, I say, okay, characters, conflict. I figure out the broad scope of the world, is it going, what the metaphysics are, and then I can get, really detailed with the geology and so forth. But I think it's more important to figure out the narrative arc that you want in this world.
And Mr. Mott, since you are a game master, not really a designer, does this sound like that's the right place for you to start if you're going to design a world, or where would you start?
Well, I usually start somewhere else entirely, but because I'm doing it for a different purpose, I'm not trying to create the entire world all at once because it's got to be done for the campaign book that's got this deadline. So I usually start off a completely different way. I start with figuring out first off exactly what sort of story I'm wanting this world to be used to tell. So that's going to influence a lot of my decisions along the way. So the first thing I want to do is figure out, am I doing something really serious? Am I doing something really dark? Am I doing something light? Am I doing something like epic fantasy heroic? Is this going to be a black and white world or shades of gray? That sort of thing. I start pinning down exactly what I'm going to do with it. Then I usually start with wherever I'm going to start running my game. So, for example, using a world that's already been created, Forgotten Realms, if I'm going to start the game in Waterdeep, I'm going to design Waterdeep. Mm-hmm. And then I'm going to this is the way I do it. I start small and then start filling in the spaces as I need it. because I don't have to have everything done all at once. I can run 2 or 3 sessions in Waterdeep and then start having, okay, there's a city nearby that's like this, there's a country over here that does this, and just have those broad general strokes. And when the characters start getting into those areas, then I can start filling in the details as needed. Which is, like I said, completely antithesis to what you want to do if you're writing for an actual game. Because you can't really do that unless you're specifically releasing it that way, like a city at a time or something like that.
Well, there's
Sure.
Which, that would be kind of a cool way to release it
there's-
in the digital age, I think.
There's no reason why you couldn't actually start a world and just release a part of it at a time.
Yeah, and that's a really practical way to go about doing it.
And I would have to say what's interesting here is I'm hearing a lot of the same stuff that I do as a designer too. I learned from a young age. I started out playing a lot of Palladium books, and there's actually a Rifts book where they talk about like their approach to world building, which is they call it top down design, and they describe it as the very wide angle lens look at the world, and then you zoom in and zoom in and zoom in, and just like Darrell and Colin were saying about the conflict and the characters, and what kind of story you're trying to tell. That's for Accursed. That's what I was working on there. I was saying, well, I want to build a world where the monsters are the heroes, and then the conflict was they're fighting witches. And it just kind of, and then I did the zooming in, from there. So it sounds like we kind of all have a very similar idea, just maybe different specific implementations of that idea. So
I would not disagree with that assessment.
All right. Well, I mean, that's good. I mean, maybe it makes for a little bit of better radio if we had a bitter disagreement, but that's okay. I'm okay with that. So now that you've started, now that you've got these basic stuff nailed down, what's your next step? Anybody wants to jump in? Let's say we've got the idea, we've got the characters, we got the conflict. Where do we go from here?
We figured out that we want to tell a story about evil witches who cursed monsters, and the players
Well,
are monsters.
it's awesome that you guys are
For
talking
example.
about Accursed, but let's not use it as... I'm starting to feel a little uncomfortable
It's one that we're all familiar with, right. And it's rather new, and it's just been out a couple of weeks at the point this podcast's airing, so it's a good one to talk about.
It is the new hotness. Okay, very well.
What I would recommend...
You talk me into it.
Is that's when I start thinking about points of interest. Start moving into geography, and this is where I talk about story worlds. Where the world building it starts from a narrative base, from a story base, where it's not specific. I'm not talking about the Misty Mountains or the Shire, or I'm talking about forces of darkness and epic heroes who are opposing this darkness. Okay, now that we have our basic characters, we have our basic conflict. Now let's look at the where. Then we start talking about specific geography and points of interest, and I think for that, for me, then it gets into so what do you want? Do we want giant city-states? Sure, city-states are cool. I love a good city-state. All right, let's have one of those. Underground kingdoms? Sure. Or stuff that that whatever works for the genre, and of course supports that story. Because if we're doing, I guess Lord of the Rings, we're like, in a flying city-state, that's being hauled around by dragons, and you're like, no. Because that kind of breaks our conflict.
The famous Darrell Hardy, no.
Right. No. If we have giant city-states being carried around by dragons, we don't really need a couple barefoot short guys to go lob the ring.
So I think what you're saying is, if I'm understanding you correctly, you're saying that the next steps you take in your world building need to be focused on the narrative, but they need to weave in the themes, the core themes of what your world is about.
Right. Well, I think the second step is the concrete stuff. Because you start broad with the narrative, with the themes and the conflict and the very abstract in the abstract. And then the second stage is when you start getting more concrete with it.
Okay. Mr. McComb, what do you think is the second stage?
Yeah, I'm actually kind of thinking I do it a little bit differently depending on what the world flavor is. I mean, just like we were talking about with Ravenloft, it's okay to do homage there, but you've got to do, more subtle things with other things. I think it depends on what kind of world you're building. In some cases, if you've got a high magic world, then it makes more sense if you're focused specifically on what does magic look like, rather than, okay, what does the world look like right now? If you say, okay, what does magic look like? What can magic do? What can it accomplish? Okay, well, maybe it blew up half a continent. Maybe it pulled the moon down onto the earth. Maybe it blasted part of the earth, into the sky. Once you figure out what some of the basic physical laws of the world are, I think you can, basic physical, spiritual, etc., metaphysical. Once you start figuring out what those laws are, then you can start painting the world itself. And like Darrell was saying, you want to make sure that stuff fits in with the tone and the themes you've chosen. And you also want to make sure that you start developing your world where the conflict is, or where it's likely to be, because you don't want to, just do Lord of the Rings with everybody hanging out in the Shire all the time.
Yeah, you want to be where the action is.
I was going to say, don't start with the Shire.
Yeah. Yeah, you don't start designing in the Shire, and you don't make all the action there. Everybody just sort of hang out there, and then suddenly Saruman shows up, and they're like, oh, shit.
Yes,
how did this happen?
The scouring of the Shire, which is possibly the gentlest term I've ever heard for a bad guy's evil plan being put. It sounds like they're just cleaning the place up,
Yeah.
Oh, we scoured it, we just, put a coat of wax on it.
We just held them down with a wire, with a bristle brush, and got all the crevices.
10,000 dwarfs.
Have you seen Fatty Bulger? There's a lot of crevices.
Silverfish.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, so it sounds like, Colin, what you're describing, and also what Darrell's describing, this sounds a lot like verisimilitude that you're building into the world.
Yes, I'm not saying necessarily verisimilitude in the sense of it's got to be realistic, but it's got to be realistic within the confines of the world.
Well, that's why I didn't say realism.
Yeah.
I specifically chose not to use that word.
Oh, wow, very fancy. Well played, sir. Well played.
And I'm sure it had absolutely nothing to do with the fact that I put it in the notes that way.
Yes,
they're
very
sesquipedalian
of you.
Yeah. Okay, so we're dealing with a couple of chess players here, Darrell.
I see.
Got to be careful.
Well then, here I'll zag. Also important.
I'll go serpentine.
Also important, I think, at this stage, while you're establishing the laws of the land, as it were, the metaphysical laws of the land, you define not just how it works, but what's cool, what's exciting, and what is accessible. Because I think, going back just a little bit to like Strahd in Ravenloft and those tropes make the setting accessible. You look at the cover of a Ravenloft product, you're like, vampire on a balcony surrounded by gargoyles. You're like, okay, I know what this is. I get it. And granted, once you get into it, you're like, oh, okay, so it's not exactly like that. But by dragging out those tropes, or highlighting them, like, hey, this is a game that has this. Like, oh, okay, cool, yeah, I like that sort of thing. I want to play that. And I think this is a good time to put that in there as well. It's like, hey, we have flying city-states carried by dragons. And we're going to highlight that and be like, oh, it's that kind of game. It's a really high magic game. Cool. Yeah, I'm down with that.
So
I guess I hate that, therefore I'm not going to play it. But
you're saying that once we've identified the tropes, we're going to then highlight them by building. That's the next step as far as what we build into our world.
Yeah, you want to make them significant.
Yeah.
Yes. And I think you want to make sure you put your own enough twist on it so that it's identifiable as your world. And it's not, I don't know, it's just another giant city being carried by dragons. I don't know, it's in like 4 or 5 different worlds. I'm not sure which one this one. But, yeah.
Well, and I think I'm going to just ask you guys another question, because we have been talking about verisimilitude. In your opinion, how strong, like on a scale of 1 to 10, for your own personal style, how strong do you rate verisimilitude as something that's important to you when you are building a world?
10 for me.
10.
Again, this is not trying to be realistic. You're not trying to
we're not talking about realism.
recreate history.
We're talking about verisimilitude.
You're trying to create something that has an internal logic to it, where when you're reading the book, you may not know exactly what to expect next, but you don't want anything in there that's just going to be, the hell is this? Because it can completely break you out of that world. I mean, I've read pages of debates about the geological formation of the Lonely Mountain, because it makes no sense from a geological standpoint. But what if it's a former dormant volcano, but it's not described as volcanic? I'm just like, there's a point where you do have to accept that you're going to break away from stuff like that. But the closer you get to something that has its own internal logic, that holds itself together, that stays within the boundaries of the genre and the tone that you're specifically creating here, even if it's something that's kind of crossing genres, you want to make sure that it makes sense within those worlds. Like you were talking about the map with the rivers that didn't flow right. Most people aren't going to notice that, but it might irk them. It goes back to something that I learned in film school. It's that bitch in the back row. To explain what it is in a film, they always talk about, you have to make sure that your sound is completely clean, that you have room tone and this and that, because the audience might not notice that, but they'll notice it subconsciously, and then the little old lady in the back row is going to say that movie had horrible picture quality because the sound was wrong, or something. That they're going to notice it even if they don't notice it. And because the lady in the back row complained so much about movies, she got labeled the bitch in the back row. Okay, not as good of a funny story as I thought, apparently, but that's what I'm talking about, is you want to make it as clear as possible. Now, if you do something that does break with that, it's not a bad thing if it makes sense in the world. If you figure out a way to make it make sense in the world, then you can get away with those sort of breaks from reality. It just has to have, like I said, an internal logic.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that at all. Again, it all depends on the flavor of the world that you've established. And if you have established the flavor of your world well, then, you can get away with just about anything. In Planescape, well, okay, let's say, let's go to Wasteland instead, since I'm, playing that a lot. If My Little Pony showed up there, people would be pissed off, and they would be right to be pissed off, because we have said, this is the tone of our world, and oh, hey, by the way, here's a cartoon. And they'd be like, come on, WTF, people, this is some serious bullshit you got going on right here, because this is not the experience that we were promised.
Well, because it changes the tone.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I gotta say, But
if you have like a horse, just if someone has a horse and it's named Applejack, I mean, that's not that big a deal. It's like, oh, okay, it's a neat. That's a you're brushing it, but you're not breaking your own tone to include something like that.
I just want to say, Colin, I'm really glad to have you on, because it's really good not to be the only foul-mouthed motherfucker on the episode.
I am delighted to throw.
I think.
Yeah.
Jesus.
Well, it's not that you don't. It just, I curse a lot, and you don't really that much.
Yeah, it's true.
Our guests typically don't, but yeah, it's one thing I was talking about. You can get away with breaks like that if you plant it in the world. If you're going for something where you're wanting cities on the backs of dragons, really, really high, magic is everything, lightning train sort of world, you can get away with doing weird stuff by saying, because it adds to that sort of otherworldness of it. But if the more realistic you're trying to do something, the more realistic of a tone, the more realistic you kind of have to try to be.
Well, I'm going to play devil's advocate for a second, because I think you said a lot of great things, and I really do agree with a lot of things that you said. But at the same time, I think we're all kind of subconsciously prioritizing the world building ahead of the experience. And I think there's ways that if you wanted to support the experience with the world building, you could actually get away with things that don't necessarily make sense. And I'm going to throw some bits out there to support my argument.
Let me interrupt here very quickly and say that this is something that you figured out at the very beginning of your world building creation. Is, okay, is this the kind of world where it's the sort of thing that we can accept? Because if it is something that you can accept, that you should have figured it out well ahead of time when you were starting the whole exercise off. But if you've said, okay, we're going to be a grim, dark, Batman, Dark Knight Returns kind of fantasy, and I'm talking, about the Frank Miller thing, and we're going to do that, and then, you throw in My Little Pony. Again, that's not the sort of thing that you have earned.
Well, okay, and I'm not talking about juxtapose. I'm not talking about breaking the tone.
Right.
What I'm talking about is specifically including things in your world building that don't make sense and don't need to make sense. And I'm going to kind of explain what I mean, because I realize that's a very difficult concept to grasp in just a few words that I've given it. A good example is, let's say I want to run a game of Warhammer 40k. And in Warhammer 40k, there is this particular element of their world building that they have just decided doesn't make any sense and doesn't need to make any sense and will never make any sense. There is this other dimension called the warp, and everything having to do with the warp makes no sense. That's literally written into their world building. And it's okay with I'm okay with it. I think anyone who plays Warhammer 40k is okay with it, but they made that conscious decision to allow it in. And it has tropes and tones and ties to things like Michael Moorcock's view of chaos and things along those lines. So if you're going to build that into your world, I want to say you really need to be very, very careful if you build something in your world that doesn't make sense. But it's not I want to make our listeners understand it's not the worst thing in the world that, oh my God, this thing doesn't make any sense.
Know the rules before you break the rules.
Yeah, that's a fair point to make. If I wanted to run a game and use, let's say I'm running a convention game, right, and I want to use just a common point that we all understand to get you guys on board with my idea, I'm going to run a game set in Dark City from the film Dark City.
Yes.
It doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense at all because there's a city just sort of floating in space and nobody knows or cares why that is. But that's part of like the experience of Dark City, if you see what I'm saying. So in this case, the world building is supporting the experience, and I think under those circumstances, it's okay to have things that aren't that break that verisimilitude. But again, know the rules before you break them.
Well, again, you're setting up a. I think we're all on the same page here. It's just that possibly we're having a little bit of disagreement of terms, because I am all about having unanswerable questions in things. We had the Lady of Pain in Planescape.
Yes.
And people would be like, "Can you just stat her up?" And we'd say, "No, she will never be statted. You cannot know about her."
Rule number 1 is don't fuck with the Lady of Pain.
Yeah,
thou shalt not fuck with the Lady of Pain.
The basic rule we had in-house was the Lady of Pain is sacred. She will not be defined. She will not be set into any boxes. She breaks all the rules that we want because she is at the core of the setting. And I think that if you have something like that, Dark City, the city was at the core of the setting. So it just, okay, this is the thing that we accept. So
the Dark Powers in Ravenloft.
Yeah, that's the thing we accept. We don't know what those are. Or if we're talking about Numenera, you've got, this is the 9th world. Well, what were the previous 8? Like, who knows? They were...
Well, the 6th was Shadowrun, the 4th
was... So,
I'll make
think
a
you're
note
right.
to
This discussion is good because we are defining points, and I'm just trying to do it because I don't want our listeners to think that, some of the things that we're saying is the only way to build a world. That's all I'm getting at.
Yeah, no.
But if they want to do it right, I'm just saying. Listen to them.
Yeah, nobody's going to like your world if you don't do it the way we tell you. But you guys go ahead and do your own thing.
That's right.
All right.
There is one thing I wanted to talk about a little bit, which is this is something that again comes in because I'm not doing this professionally. I'm running a home game, and right around this point where you guys are talking about starting to do the locations and working out your characters, this is the point where I have to figure out for me: am I making a world or am I making a campaign? Which is two completely different things.
Yes, it is.
I can think of a very good example of a professionally published world that was built through a series of campaigns, and that is the Pathfinder world.
Galarian?
Thank you.
Sure thing.
I'm going to get lynched for that one, but
also Dragonlance, Forgotten Realms, etc.
Well, kind of, but not nearly as much as the Pathfinder world was built through their adventure paths. Each one focused on a new little area and explored new little parts of it in terms, and the tones would change wildly depending on which part of it you were in and which adventure path you were running.
Did you just say that Pathfinder developed itself more through adventures than Dragonlance did? Because that's a bold claim, sir.
I can't say I've never run any Dragonlance adventures. I've just read the novels. So
okay.
So I will not say that, but it's the one that I am most familiar with. Let's put it that way.
All right.
But that is a way to do it, and that's a way a lot of game masters at home are probably going to approach it. Is you have to think, am I building just the campaign? In which case, you kind of get a little bit more tunnel vision because you're not focused on the entire overall world. You're just focused on what the party is going to experience as they go through. And it's a completely different beast, and it's a completely different way of approaching it. So it's something you have to keep in mind if you are trying to make a world. If you are trying to do world building, unless you're doing something like Pathfinder and apparently Dragonlance did, you have to approach a completely different way, and it's the way that these guys are describing.
I don't disagree with that. I think all of us are approaching it from the standpoint that we're building worlds towards the goal of making that part of an experience, and the experience is, in your words, is the campaign, right? I mean, we're not just building worlds to put in our little booklet and slide in our bookshelf, right? We're building worlds so people can play in them, and I think maybe it's just a question of scale, really, is when you talk about, like, when you say designing it for a campaign as opposed to whatever the other alternative would be.
It's not designing the world for the campaign. It's, are you designing the world or are you designing the campaign? Because designing the campaign is going to be completely different the way you're approaching it. And because in a world, you're not just focused on, okay, these are the events that are going to happen over the campaign. I need to work. This is what's happening. You have to be able to account for multiple campaigns that may run in that world.
Okay, well, that's fair.
One of them you're building an actual world, and in another one you're building a narrative arc.
Okay, yeah, that's exactly. A fair point. That's a fair point. And just to be clear, we are for tonight's episode, we are focusing on the world rather than.
But that reminds me. Did you guys ever read Lord of Light by Roger Zelazny?
No,
I have not.
Sitting in my stack with about 30 other books to get to.
Okay, I would recommend putting it up at the very top of the stack because it's probably one of my favorite all-time books ever. But, well, okay, I guess it's not going to mean anything if you guys haven't read it. God damn it! All right, you know what? All right, fuck that story. I'm done.
You can go ahead and tell. Go ahead.
Some of our listeners
will probably
No, it's ruined. Okay.
Just because we're plebeians doesn't mean our listeners
Philistines.
Okay. So anyway, this is a story about gods and technology and a war that sweeps across centuries. And at the end of it, it talks about spoilers. At the end, it talks about how Sam went off to another continent on this world, and it's like, holy shit, this is just a campaign right here. It was this richly imagined, hugely awesome world, and then it's like, oh man, this is just like one of the stories that's happened here in this thing. And I think that has played a huge part in how I approach developing worlds, which is that you've got to have really cool stuff concentrated, but you can have a lot of different pockets of that stuff concentrated all over the place.
So you're saying keep in mind the scale.
Yeah.
When you're building your world.
Well, and also scatter cool all over the place.
Absolutely.
Scatter cool. I like that. Put that on the motivational poster.
So one
little
thing
sticker above the computer. Scatter cool.
Whenever I'm reading a campaign setting, whenever I'm thinking about a world to run a game in for a role-playing game, one thing that always is of importance to me is white space in a world. I want to ask you guys, and I'd like to start with Mr. Hardy because he's been very quiet lately. Mr. Hardy, what would you say is the importance of white space when you're designing, when you are world building?
Well, that's obvious. That's where the game master can make it his own, and actually run with what you've given him, and it gives the players room to mess around with too. Because if you establish that, I don't know, so and so is the king, is the king here, and the whole campaign, it's the Lady of Pain. The players can't make their mark taking on the Lady of Pain. But if you have some white space, you're like, well, there's some lords and ladies, and they're here are their stats, and knock yourselves out, guys. It gives them room to make their own stories, to tell their own stories.
Yeah, let's define white space, and I think you actually just did. It's a place for the players and the GM to tell their own stories in the context of the world that you've created.
Right. It's kind of where the designer passes the baton to the game master. Here. Or the pencil, perhaps, would be a better metaphor. Here, okay. You figure it out. I think that's important because there are different game masters have different things. I mean, they're probably. I assume there are those who are like, awesome. Here is this country, this city, this planet is written up in meticulous detail. Every square mile of this place is completely specced out. Fantastic. I don't have to, I don't have time to make stuff up. Great. It's all right here. But then you have the other game masters who are like, well, don't hem me in. Maybe I don't want to tell stories with these characters and these exact locations that you have specced up. Is there someplace else we can go with this?
Okay, Mr. McComb, what would you say about the importance of white space?
Well, I've had a similar experience with people writing in and being like, "Oh, what's happening over here?" It's like, I don't know, we left it blank on purpose, man. We want you guys to go crazy, not feel like it's something that we're going to define for you. And I think it's important to have some of those places, but there's always the danger that somebody is going to look at it and say, we haven't done anything in this area yet, and then somebody's going to come running along and ruin it for everybody else. It's like, oh well, it's canon now, guys. Sorry. Yeah. So every story you guys have is we've now just nullified it. It's been obviated. Sorry.
Right. I've actually had to go back and add white space. I did Carthador, which I realized I probably should have mentioned in my character sheet. Carthador is my pulp sci-fi planetary romance Savage Worlds setting that was sort of released at Gen Con. There's hard copies floating around. There's the pre-release, and there's the main nations of the continent are fairly well defined. I mean, there's not city by city, state by state, or anything. But I realized that I had pretty much carved up the entire continent in that. So I was like, oh wait, and I could just kind of feel the pressing walls and the lack of white space. So I'm like, and then there are border kingdoms between them that aren't on this map, but they're there. Small kingdoms, small tribes and fiefdoms. Too high up in the mountains, too deep in the forests for the empire to mess around with. Backtracking after the fact, like, oh wait, I should probably have some of that.
Yeah, you should. Well, the thing about white space, it is important to me because I like the opportunity to tell my own stories, but it actually made me think a little bit more about like kind of the role of the world when it comes to allowing people to take part in it, to have opportunities to change it, if you will. And to use Mr. Hardy's term in his story world, he calls these nodes. And I like to think of them as agency nodes. Basically, when you're world building, for me, one of the things I love to do is intentionally put in like little parts of the world that are in a state where the player characters can obviously make a difference, can obviously make some kind of change to it. And I want to call out Colin specifically because I think Birthright and Thunder Rift both did this excellently. They both had multiple nodes where you could just look at. In Birthright's case, you can literally just look at the map and say, oh, well, we can make a difference here. And those are things I think are a wonderful part of world building that are actually very closely related to white space.
Yeah, the problem with I think white space is really important if you're talking about just a basic campaign setting, but the longer any campaign setting goes on, the more material you build up, the less room you have to explore in the stuff that you have defined. And eventually somebody is going to be like, okay, well, there is this white space here. And it becomes, I guess the longevity of the line itself becomes a threat to the longevity of the line, because you've got to find a way to expand. And that's why you wind up with things like with Karatur or Maztica or Spelljammer or
The original World of Darkness.
Well,
yeah,
That's what
exactly.
I was thinking.
Or
you just blow it up.
I want to clarify because I was kind of getting ahead of myself, but I was basically trying to get to the point to saying that white space isn't necessarily geographical. White space is actually has to do with like the understanding that the world can change, that the player characters can have an impact and an agency on the world. Because there's examples we've talked about. Darrell and I discussed the Forgotten Realms at one point, and we discussed the Elminster syndrome, where player characters just don't feel like they have any agency. Whether there's white space or not, there's just like, well, Elminster would just fix it, you know. That's what I'm getting at. Is I think white space is a term that doesn't have to apply to just a map. It can apply to also the nodes, as Darrell says, the nodes in the story world, where player characters feel like that, oh, we can come in here and do something about this part of the world will be different because we have taken part in it.
Right.
Does that make sense? Am I rambling?
No, it makes sense. It just I don't think it's necessarily counter to what we were saying, which is that, you know, the longer a campaign world happens, the more stuff gets filled in. And you might be like, okay, well, you know what? I've set up my kingdom over here in, I don't know, let's say in Anweir. And and then, you know, next month a product comes out and says, and the new king of Anweir is, and you're like, oh, come on.
yeah. Okay, I see what you're saying there. Okay.
And that can be a problem from a consumer point of view when it comes to choosing a world to play in, is, especially with the more well-known it is, the worse it can get, where if there's not a lot of white space, that means there's a lot of stuff filled in, and you have that one guy, when you're trying to run Forgotten Realms, who has every single Dritz book, every single Elminster book. He's the only person who's actually read the Cleric Quintet, and he will sit there and argue with you over every single point because he already knows it all because he's got all the books.
Yeah, and it's like, oh, well, you have valid points, and I would just like to... Oh, I can't do that because Trist already took care of that for me. Okay, well, forget it. That's part of why you keep doing the resets as well.
Right. So,
and then there's also the flip side of the coin, where I've heard a lot of people complaining recently about some products that have been coming out where there was way too much white space, where they're saying, okay, what am I paying you $35-$40 for if you're making me do all the work?
Well, let's ask another question here, because I think we're really actually touching on some really fascinating parts about world building, without, like, we just haven't really, you know, maybe defined some of those terms quite so well. But what you're talking about, Colin, is you're basically talking about a timeline that's advancing and things that are changing in response to the advancement of time. Okay? Mm-hmm. And there are certain campaign settings that do not have timeline advancement, that literally say, you know, there is an end point, and we are playing, you know, maybe 6 months, a year, 5 years before that end point. But there is kind of and this kind of freezes the status quo to an extent, in that it keeps your tropes and it keeps your, maybe some of the things like, well, the new King of Anweir. If we know that there is still no King of Anweir in 999 AD, and we're not ever going past 999 AD, you know, that can kind of, for lack of a better word, can kind of cryo-freeze some of those elements in place.
Sure, but even you're like, okay, so then, you know, I've got somebody over here in Alamy, and then you have then a Realms book for Alamy comes out, and you're like, oh, that's not what we're doing.
Well, okay.
Even if you're not advancing it chronologically, I mean, just as you fill in the holes in the information, you know, the stuff that the game master, the players have filled in for themselves, you know, where they said, yes, there's no king, we know there will never be a king, you know, so we're going to go set this thing up, and then the Anweir sourcebook comes out and says, yes, because it's actually run by the Secret Society of Sorcerers. And you're like, oh, we didn't have any. What? Okay.
Well, yeah, and that has definitely happened in the past with different campaign settings. There's no doubt about that is true. From the standpoint of a GM, though, I guess what I'm saying, you know, for our listeners, who I assume they're going to be thinking about, like, I'm a GM, I'm going to be running, creating a world for my players. You know, what's the most important thing for them to understand with regards to white space, or progression of time, or any of those things we just touched on?
That none of it's gospel. Yeah. I mean, just because you bought the book doesn't mean you have to use it. That sounds terrible. You should always buy the book.
Thanks for your money.
You're ruining my business model.
But I mean, just it. You don't have to use it in this campaign. Nice
use the parts you like, I think, is what you're saying.
Yes, that your story. I mean, going back to when we very first started, we start the process from the story, from the characters and the conflict and the tone. And in your own home game, I think that's still the most important thing is your story, the story of your characters and their adventures and their conflict. And the world exists to tell that story, to support that story. And so if more parts of the world officially come to light that don't work for that story, then I think you have an obligation to ignore those parts. Because your story is more important than the backstory that you picked up at Walden Books.
Can I just? I want to say I think the experience maybe rather because a lot of game masters prioritize story over the gaming experience, and I'm just gonna to avoid some bad experiences I've had, I would prefer to say the experience rather than the story is the most important part.
Right. The experience of the whole group as opposed to the game master's story.
Yeah, thank you.
Right. Well, in theory, those should be united.
Yes.
But I agree with you 100%. What we do as game designers is we're creating stuff to help game masters out with their games, and it's important to recognize what the verb is there. We are trying to help. We don't want to take over. This is not our game. We're not like, okay, Colin McComb says that it's got to be like this. Darrell Hardy says you've got to play the game exactly like this, and if you don't do that, then you're not playing my game.
You're playing it wrong.
That's right.
You realize we're going to use that sound clip, right?
Sure. You go right ahead. But the important thing is that this is not our game. We're not sitting down. We're not having, our fun is in creating this and playing in our games. But when you're playing in your game, do whatever the hell you want. If you want to make the Lady of Pain 6 squirrels on top of each other's shoulders and floating around and chittering under the robes, you go right ahead. If you want to tell people what. This is your game. If you want to have a King of Anweir, that's fine. If you want to have My Little Pony and Accursed, you go right ahead. None of us will stop you. Hasbro might, but we will not.
And that's why it's not OGL.
Well, and I'm going to say, specifically for Birthright, the whole idea of the Shattered Empire and the fact that there was still a throne and the throne was vacant, that was, to me, that's one of those, as I was saying, those agency nodes. You were kind of obviously saying, I'm providing you with this point where as you as a player characters, you can this is the goal, this is one of the things you can do, is reunite Anweir and become the new emperor.
Yes, that was exactly what we were trying to do there as well, because that was the thematic point of the whole thing, which is we are getting out of your way and giving you the tools to create an epic story for yourselves.
Right, and that's what I'm getting at, is when you're world building, and I like to see those agency nodes pop up. I'm just giving people an example of something I thought was really well done. So there's that.
Thank you very much.
So I think we've definitely covered white space. One question I think it's a really good one to have, especially for all of us are game masters, and we've all been players as well. So I'm going to pitch this first to Mr. Mott, but what role do you think players have in world building as opposed to the game master?
I have a very specific viewpoint on this, and it's counter to what a lot of games out there are doing right now, where there's a lot of them that actually give a lot of that world building and adventure design to the players specifically, so they can feel like they're more part of telling the story. I'm not a fan of that. Again, this is just my personal taste on it. I think that it's the game master's job is mostly the world building. And if you're one of those people who kind of want to shove some of that off, that's fine. I actually did that with one of the worlds that I made for a 4th edition D&D game I ran. I'd set up a wiki, and I just, here's where we started, here's the kingdom we started in, here's the city we started in, here's a few things that I've kind of done so far, and they're very, like, broad brushes. If you want to, you guys, here's the login and password for it. Go in and fill in these sections to fit your character, or fit what story you're wanting to tell. And one of my players ran with it, and he took this sort of tribal nation that I had that I wasn't going to do much with in the first, like, several games, and he went through and created this big, huge chunk of the world that I ended up using, and it was really cool the way he did. He picked up exactly what I was doing, and he ran with it, and that was really cool. But every other experience I've had with thing like that, it usually, that's when you get those big breaks in verisimilitude, is when you let the players in on it, especially if you're running the game, and they don't necessarily, they may not know what your end game is, they may not know what you're going for right off the bat, so they may take things completely wild directions, which is why I'm typically not a fan of it. But in terms of overall, though, what you guys are talking about in with player role and world building when it comes to game design perspective, I'm thinking along the lines would be either one of the things that I've seen a lot of the companies do every once in a while. They did this a lot in the old days, like whenever the presidential election in Shadowrun, when Dunkelzahn won the presidency. Spoiler alert. But that was a fan-based write-in poll where they had all the candidates that had been a big block of the adventure that they had done for a while, and at Gen Con they announced the presidency, who won the election based on who voted at the convention and who mailed in their little slips.
Well, there was that hanging Chad thing in Florida, but...
And then another one that Wizards of the Coast is doing recently, I think it's with the most recent season of Encounters, is they're having everyone write in with what's going on in their section of the game, and it all comes together in the overall story. And it's actually helping to shape the world because they're doing another big cataclysm in Forgotten Realms to kind of hit a reset button, and they're trying to get player input on it. And that's the way they're doing it. So, at least that's the way I think that even professional game design companies can have their players involved in the world building, aside from just leaving these, like Ross was saying, agent points, I think is what...
Agency node, but yes.
Agency node. Those sort of things. Aside from that, you can even incorporate your players that way.
Mr. Hardy, what would you say for how players can get involved with world building?
Well, I think the same way that the core, I keep coming back to it, but the core of the world is characters. Characters in conflict in your tone, and I think the heart of your as the game master, so that's the world, and then we zoom in on the party and the adventures of the party as run by the game master of the players. Again, the heart of that is the characters and the conflict. Which of course will probably be much smaller, more specific, because it's just this handful of people going on their adventure. But I think that you can take that even smaller by zooming in on a specific character, who is again shaped by the conflict. And if the player can help define that conflict by creating a part of the world, I think in cooperation with the game master, and that's where Mr. Mott was saying you could have problems. Obviously, you have to work with the game master, so it's not. Yes, and I was raised on a pony farm because I'm actually a pony. No, you can't do that. But if you want to say something like, yeah, I've joined this adventuring band because I need to raise 10,000 gold in the next 6 months, or the Slavers Guild will kill my family. As a game master, you might go like, Slavers Guild? There's no... Well, there could be. We have slavery. We have guilds. Sure, there could be a Slavers Guild. That's kind of cool. Okay, sure, let's run with that.
But 10,000 is too much.
Yes.
All right.
Your family sucks. Sorry, I didn't mean to.
We're gonna definitely put that in the show notes. Your family sucks.
Your family sucks.
I think we've got a subtitle for the episode now.
Oh yeah.
Great.
So, Mr. McComb, what do you think?
Sorry, I didn't mean to step on Darrell. I just
okay.
Throwing that.
Darrell, did you have more to say about that?
In summation, player input good.
Okay.
In cooperation with the game master. There. Your own personal white space. How's that?
That's good. Mr. McComb.
Yeah, every bit of the game should be the player's white space, I think. I mean, everything is fair game for the player to build on. The GM has ultimate fiat at the table in general, I think, but if depending on what the game is and how epic the campaign is going to be, you could say, okay, we're just going to stick with with published canon for this world, and then you guys work within that space, or you can say, you know what, this is our starting point, and then from here on out, you guys are doing everything. And if you want to bring in, little stories that attach onto this, if you want to have the Slavers Guild, maybe you've got, then you could say, oh, Slavers Guild, okay, great. Well, is there just one guild? Are there competing slavery factions? And you can just start to build all that stuff off of there just from somebody saying, 2 words, Slavery Guild or Slavers Guild. And I think that players need to have that sense of agency within the world in order to keep them interested in the game, because let's face it, we're not, we don't play these games so we can have somebody else tell us, what we're doing. That's not why we play these.
I'm going to call out actually a very recent game that did some things on this very specific topic, and I think it did really, really well with them, and that game is called 13th Age. I don't know if you guys are familiar with it.
I am familiar with the name. I have not played it.
So one of the things that 13th Age does is it says when you make a character, you get to do a couple of specific things related to world building. The first is you get to say one unique thing about your character. And some of the examples they give is, I am the only halfling knight in the Queen's service. So you are doing a little bit of world building by establishing how your character is unique. Now, obviously, to assuage Mr. Mott's concerns, you would need to do this with Mr. Hardy's thing in mind, that you're sticking to the tone and the conflict and the characters that are important to your particular campaign. But if you stay within those boundaries that you have all agreed on, right, I think that's a wonderful way for a character to do some world building. And it actually goes a little further than that. 13th Age also says you have a background skill, and this background skill is what you did before you were an adventurer. And it does not encourage you to do things like bartender, because bartender is kind of a boring skill. You could put down pirate, which is a cooler skill, but what they really want you to write down is, sailed the sea of stars with Captain Bloodhook, and that's your skill, right? That's your background skill. And again, I think that's a really neat way to turn something that's even a mechanic in the game into a point where you as the player can have an impact on the world. I think those are really cool and fun ways, because to me, what those things are saying is not just, I'm a player, I'm helping develop the world, but you're also saying, these are things I want to have come up and be important in the campaign.
Yeah, they're engagement anchors.
Yes, exactly.
Oh man, you guys are getting really ludological here.
I'm going to say, if you drop agency node, I'll give you engagement anchors. That's awesome. Yeah,
Mr. Hardy
really cool.
is one of the reasons why I wanted him on the show, is because he's got a really excellent way to name all these little things. So
that's nice. Okay, so engagement anchors, go.
Okay, yeah. Well, it's cool because it gives you, like from my example, the Slavers Guild, it writes the character in the world and creates, as part of the background, and gives the player engagement into the world and some motivation, built-in conflict. But what was really cool with what you're saying there with the 13th Age is it not just background, but stuff for the future. Gives plot hooks to the GM, and you're right. It's laying groundwork for future adventures, and I think that's cool. I agree.
Okay.
Agree with the coolness.
Well, I think I think the appropriate thing at the time, because we are running a little long on our show, so let's talk about the last question I want to throw at you guys regarding to world building, is what point do you say it's done? Where do you stop? If you're constructing a world and you say, where's the point where you say, I have done enough?
What's my target audience? Am I? I seriously, it makes a big difference.
Okay.
Am I developing a computer game? Because if that's the case, then I can just say, okay, whatever is within the bounds of, the scope of my map here. I don't have to worry about what's going on out here. I can just, throw rumors and, tiny little webs and plot hooks out there that are never going to come to fruition. But if we're talking about a box or a campaign setting, then I need to, actually develop that stuff. Within the game for the computer game, I've got to be extraordinarily detailed while I'm right in there. But for a campaign setting, I can be like, okay, here's an area that's more heavily detailed, but I've got to get all the rest of this as well.
There's a little piece of me that just started jumping up and down with excitement because you almost said boxed set.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I just oh boy, he almost said box set. I know what he needs.
I know. I was like, oh wait, a lot of people probably don't get that now. You can't see it, but there's a tiny tear running down my cheek.
Oh, like the Indian. Oh no.
Exactly.
We had boxes. We had maps. Oh,
as was the fashion at the time.
That's right. Sometimes they had dice.
Mr. Mott, where do you stop?
Onions on the belt.
I actually would rather hear your answer, Ross, because you worked in a different medium. You didn't have any sort of artificial limitations when you were creating the world for Accursed, because it was a digital product. You didn't have, oh crap, we have to keep this under X page count, so we need to start. Where did you decide on Accursed?
Yeah, that's
okay. This is enough for now.
Well, for me,
that's a great question. Because Darrell and I have both been, okay, you've got 64 pages for book 1, and you've got 32 pages for book 2, and you've got 3-color poster map, go.
Well, okay, so first of all, it's important to point out that Accursed was not designed as a standalone product. We wanted to leave some room to make more books for it. So there were certain points where we were like, well, we can do more with this, but we're going to, first of all, see if the Kickstarter succeeds. And if the Kickstarter succeeds, then we have a plan for doing that, for doing more things with it. But from the standpoint of just the core book, where I stopped is I wanted to find a balance point where I felt like I had given enough of the world building to the reader, to the player, to the game master, so that they can create compelling stories and still have enough of that feeling of agency, that feeling of white space, that they can then take it and move forward with it. So I wanted to find that balance point. I wanted to find the point where I feel like, yes, I have given you a solid foundation for you to build now your own stories. And I didn't crowd you out. I didn't just to keep going with the building or the architect, paradigm. I didn't just fill the building full of crap, right, where there's no room for you to rearrange the furniture. I wanted to give you a nice enough framework that you could then make, sort of go in and do your own interior design. Ooh. And that's the balance I tried to strike with the, that's when I considered it done.
When are you going to call it done when it comes to the additional products, though, as well?
Well, that's going to be based on the market. If people want,
the money stops coming
more Accursed,
in,
I will make more Accursed because I love making more Accursed. So it's only from a business standpoint, it's only done when people no longer want to pay for it. So there you go. But
because there is one phrase I wanted to bring in when it comes to where do you stop, and that is painting yourself into a corner.
Ah, yes, this is the famous Rick Priestley point that he made about world building. Mr. Hardy, Mr. McComb, are you familiar with Rick Priestley?
No. Sounds familiar, but no.
Rick and Brian Ansell are the two guys that created Warhammer 40,000 and the Warhammer Fantasy settings.
Oh, God, okay.
And Rick Priestley.
That Rick Priestley, okay.
Oh, Rick Priestley.
So Rick Priestley had a very interesting thing to say about world building, and that has to do with kind of some of the unanswerable questions, like you were pointing out earlier, Colin. Is that he's saying, as a designer, you never want to get to the point where you have painted yourself into a corner in your world. You always want to leave yourself an out. And what he was getting at is he was actually specifically talking about the use of an unreliable narrator to describe sections of the world, sections of the universe, to allow for to allow that setting to remain dynamic and change and respond over time. Was he was saying that you can't believe everything that you're told. But I think you can apply that statement that you don't want to paint yourself into a corner into a much broader sense when you're talking about world building, and that's I think where Mr. Mott was coming from.
to answer the question for Carthador when it was done, and that actually was possibly even more than a cursed. I was just kind of the lone lunatic because my contract with Reality Blur, it was not a work for hire thing, where you need so many pages. It was, yes, you write that thing, and assuming it doesn't suck, we'll publish it. And
it got published, so
right. So apparently it didn't suck. But the upside, or the upshot of that is that it is the biggest book that Reality Blurs has done.
Really?
Because
that's cool.
And so I think when I well, I don't. So when it's done, and because the way the Carthador is set up with the 9 different nations, each one has its own feel, its own tone. I mean, it's not like Torg, wildly divergent. I mean, it's all still pulp sci-fi, but each one has its own shtick. And so I think when I felt that that a GM could confidently run an adventure in one of those nations, I can ignore the other 8 chapters of the book, and I can run a cool campaign just in this one. That I felt, okay, that one is done. Now if I can get all 9 of them to that level, then we're good. And turns out that took a lot of pages. I haven't heard any complaints, so so far so good.
Mr. McComb?
Well, I guess I'm going to draw from the experience of Birthright here. Obviously for the box set, which is, the box set, not just a campaign setting, but an actual box set. We had the player's guide, we had, the various rules books. What we wanted to do was set up the broad outlines of the world and then really focus on one particular area that had the playability. So at that point we started approaching it like Darrell was saying about building a campaign. You do the broad strokes at one part, and then you say, okay, this is the part we're building on. And then, once you've got that done, you're done.
Well, so I would say that, in a larger sense, from the idea that we're all creators, there's probably a point at which you can say and be really serious that these projects are never really done; they're just abandoned.
That's any project creative.
Yeah, I think
I'm trying to remember who the quote is.
Right, but I think it's also true for campaign settings and for world building. Even if you're a GM, I mean, I know I have an unpublished setting that I as a GM have run many times called Shadows Angelus, and it is constantly sort of still simmering on the back burner, even though it's been years and years since I've ran it. Right, so. I think, it's done, but it's only done as far as the particular goal you're looking at right now. And in the future, you can always come back to it. There's nothing saying that it's forever and ever, amen, will never change, right? I mean, even Birthright got a fan update for 3rd edition, which I was proud to work on. So there you go.
Official thumbs up.
All right, thank you. There's going to be a lot of very happy people on Birthright.net to hear that, by the way. So
here's a message for everybody on Birthright.net. You guys are all awesome. Thank you.
I think we just doubled our listenership for this particular episode. All right.
There's your sound clip for tonight.
There you go.
Sorry. Anyway, please keep going.
No. I think. Well, actually, we're kind of at the last call. The bartender signaling me, and the Imperial soldiers are going to be by shortly to enforce that curfew. So we had better close out. But we need to again make sure that our listeners know where they can find you on the web and what your latest thing is that they should be looking for. Let's start with Mr. Hardy. Where can we find you on the interwebs?
DarrellHardy.com. That's DarrEll. The right way to spell Darrell. Hardy.com.
I've been looking at it throughout the podcast tonight. Let me give a plug here. There's a lot of good stuff on there.
Woot! There you have it. Seal of approval.
Yeah, I almost want to use the Newhart joke. Tonight our guests are Colin, his other guest Darrell, and the other guest Darrell. His colleague Darrell and his other colleague Darrell.
Sick of that fucking show.
And if
at least the only thing I'm glad about is the character Darrell on Walking Dead has kind of way eclipsed that.
Yeah,
so
true.
I got no problem with that one. Compare me to a badass redneck with a crossbow. I'm fine with that.
Yes, Darrell is cool again. I mean, for the first time. So DarrellHardy.com, and if you want to support my efforts, you can go buy some My Little Pony CCG, which is not actually aimed for little girls. And of course, Carthador coming out any minute now from Reality Blurs. If you want to see my world building in action.
So, Mr. McComb, where can we find you on the interwebs, and what's your latest thing?
Let's see, you can find me at colinmccomb.com. It's probably a better bet to follow me on Twitter or, let's see, in a cursed adventure, which I'm going to be working on for January. I've got a Stories and Christmas Promises Adventure Bone anthology coming up. There's my Oathbreaker fiction. Then, of course, there's Wasteland 2, which will be coming out sometime in early 2014. And then after that will be Torment Tides of Numenera, where I'm doing games and novellas and comics. And
it was a very, very successful Kickstarter.
Yes. And a very successful Kickstarter means that you've got to do a lot of work.
It's true.
Oh, yeah.
It's true. So I want to say we're definitely looking forward to looking at all of that, Colin and Darrell. I'm looking forward to seeing your stuff too. And we want to say, Darrell Mott, that is, and I both want to say we're very grateful to have you guys come on the show. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having us. It was a lot of fun.
Fantastic. And it's an awesome thing to have both you guys on, especially to talk about this particular topic, because I think, again, there's very few people, I think, that would speak more eloquently about it than you two. So with that, we're going to say goodnight and catch us next time on the Gamers Tavern.
And that wraps things up this week for the Gamers Tavern. We had a lot of great comments this week. It's really good to hear from you guys. Unfortunately, I'm incredibly pressed for time because a lot of crap's been going on. So I'm sorry, but they're going to have to wait for next week. I would like to thank the Grumpy Celt for clarifying the pronunciation on his name, though. So we'll be pronouncing it correctly from here on out. And I also want to thank our guests, Colin McComb and Darrell Hardy, for taking the time out of their schedules to be with us and discuss world building with us. Next week, we've got not one, but two very special things in store for you. One of those is a secret. You're going to have to wait until next week to find out. I'm sorry. Not really. I love teasing you. But I do have one thing I can tell you. Next week's episode is the first annual Gamers Tavern Award Show. It is Ross and I showing our appreciation for the best in gaming from all of last year, 2013. And it's a doozy. I actually wore a tie for it because it's a special occasion. Not exactly sure why, since this is a podcast and it's audio only, but yeah, like I need an excuse to wear a tie. Anyway, this podcast is licensed under a Creative Commons Non-Commercial No Derivatives 3.0 license. So, until next time, gamers, the tavern is closed.
Have you been looking for a dark fantasy RPG setting? Are you interested in seeing a new take on the action horror genre? Then you should check out Accursed. Accursed is a setting for the Savage Worlds RPG created by me, Ross Watson, and my good friends Jason Marker and John Dunn. It is a world where the heroes are monsters who fight for redemption against the witches who have conquered their land. To find out more about Accursed, search for Accursed on drivethrurpg.com. Accursed is now on sale there and in many other fine retailers for gaming PDFs. Thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy Accursed.